Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Jeff Schnader. Jeff is a retired professor from Eastern Virginia Medical School. He graduated from Columbia College class of 1975 and participated in the sit-ins, marches, and protests against the war in Vietnam. Today, he's with us to share his first-hand experience with his novel, The Serpent Papers. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So, Jeff, the story of war and the resistance or resistance against war is a story that continues repeating itself from the time that we know about soldier and about conflict, one nation against the other, until today that we are experiencing a war. It's just a story that just continue repeating over and over again. And you highlight that in your novel, The Serpent Papers. I wonder if we could start with you telling us a little bit about yourself. Of course, it's interrelated with the novel, but tell us about your background.
Well, first of all, I totally agree with you about war. And just along those lines, the Greek historian Thucydides in 440 BC did say in his account of the Athenians' war against the Spartans in the Peloponnesian Wars, which was his book's title, that he's the first one to say, quote, "History repeats itself," unquote. So yes, of course, I totally subscribe to that idea and agree with you. My background is that I came from New York originally, and I went to Columbia University in New York, entering in 1971, as does my main character in my novel. And I graduated in 1975. And while I was there, I protested against the war. I went on to get my medical degree from McGill University in Montreal. So I did live in Montreal actually for 5 years, and it wasn't because I was left back a year, but I also did a research year at McGill as well. So I was there for 5 years and became a physician. And while a physician, I went into pulmonary and critical care medicine, and eventually ran an intensive care unit for 15 years. I also served while I was a full professor of medicine and did academics, lecturing widely across the nation and internationally, probably close to 130, 140 times. I wrote about 50 medical papers and was an editor of a medical journal for 8 years. I served the veterans in the United States Veterans Hospital System for 22 years of my 40-year career, and I'm very proud of that. It was my way of giving back to the men who had fought in wars and also who had fought in the Vietnam War. So in spite of protesting against the Vietnam War, which I thought was not a righteous war, shall we say, unlike World War II, which one might call a righteous war, you can't really call war good, so there really weren't any good wars. But World War II, we were fighting against monsters and we had to defeat them. Vietnam was somewhat different. I did not think it was a righteous war. I did not think it was a good war. I protested against it. But I was horrified when the American veterans, the boys who had served in that war and who put their lives on the line, many were killed, many injured and had terrible PTSD and other damage from the Vietnam War. I was horrified when they were vilified by my fellow protesters. And I always was haunted by this over 50 years since that happened. And so I wrote this book with a passion to show that my generation, which has been broken over this war, there's been a great rift over this war in terms of just the way it is today. There was a great polarity in society between those who were for the war or those who were against the war. Today's society has similar polarities in it. It haunted me, and the book is a way of resolving those feelings. So if one reads the book, you'll see that there's a main character who embodies both ends of the spectrum. He comes from a military family. He's expected to go to war and volunteer for Vietnam, become an officer. And he rejects that and goes to Colombia instead, while his best friend goes to Vietnam. So he goes to Colombia thinking of, with a very pro-war mindset. And in the end, he confronts the idea of being against the war and what wars may be worthy and righteous and which ones are not. And for me, serving the veterans was helpful, but writing the book did heal my soul, so to speak. And having written the book now, I am not haunted as much as I was before. In fact, I'm not haunted by the Vietnam War. I feel relieved by it for having written the book and for having resolution of that war in my main character.
Well, and hopefully you help others relieve of all the uncertainty and questions that they have about that war itself as well. And it is my belief that the soldiers of that war, they were also victims of the war. Whether they were patriots or whether they were obliged to be there, they were victims. And to be received with this animosity by the protesters, I also see it out of place. I think I have seen videos in which soldiers are returning, and then some of the protesters spit on their faces. And if there is an evil in this story, in the real life and in the novel, I think it's the government itself that gets people involved in many of these wars without thinking through, without falling victim of the military complex. And in my mind, I see that as in the case of the United States, the evil person, not the soldiers who go there either because they want to defend their country or because they are told to.
Yes, I think I have to agree in large measure with you, but I would say a little more about it because I lived through those times, and unless you did, it's hard to remember what it was like. In 1971-72, while Vietnam was in full swing and there were protests against that war, there were really reasons to have that war. I mean, there actually were reasons, and they on the surface of things, they were not bad reasons. We were in the midst of a Cold War, right, with the Soviet Union and China, and the idea of communism was very scary to the American public. And there was an arms race, an atomic arms race, which had been going on for 20 years and more than 20 years. And Americans were afraid, and the Soviet Union and the United States were stockpiling weapons, tremendous amounts of weapons. Americans were building bomb shelters to protect themselves. They were so afraid. They were actually spending thousands of dollars, which at that time was a tremendous amount of money, building bomb shelters, which, of course, in retrospect, we know would never have worked against the fallout of a nuclear war. People were afraid. And then there was Dwight D. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, who was John Foster Dulles. He theorized something called the domino theory, whereby if Vietnam fell or any of the countries in Southeast Asia fell, the others would fall like dominoes. And the American public was afraid that the Soviet Union would expand its sphere of influence at the expense of the United States' sphere of influence, and communism would somehow beat democracy in the world balance of power. And it was a scary prospect. John F. Kennedy subscribed to the John Foster Dulles theory. Eisenhower did, Nixon did, Johnson did. It wasn't as if this theory didn't have some credibility to it, and people were afraid. So the idea of the war, in spite of the fact that we may say that the leadership was corrupt or evil, it was more complex than that too, because there were real issues that we were grappling with and we were afraid of, and as a nation we were trying to face. What I will say is, though, that presidents, and I will actually go so far as to say, and it's true, in both parties, the Democrat and Republican parties, did lie to the American people about the reasons for the war, the conduct of the war, their plans for the war. So when Americans voted for Johnson or voted for Nixon, really what was happening was they were voting for promises that those presidents actually were not planning to keep. And it was proven that at the moment they were espousing peace, or espousing not to escalate the war, they were actually at the same time making plans to escalate the war. So although the decisions to have the war were not exactly evil, the pretenses for which those decisions were supported were sometimes dishonest. So it was a very complex situation. It was tricky. In the end, for myself, I did not believe that the war was just and that we shouldn't be fighting it. And of course, 60,000 young men died in that war. And they wanted to expand the war so that, in effect, more young men would die. And in fact, when I was protesting on campus, the president at that time had said he would not escalate the war, but he was having Paris peace talks with North Vietnam. And in order to have peace with honor, he accelerated the war to make North Vietnam want to come to the peace table. It was a bit of a paradox. We want peace, but we're going to accelerate the war in order to have peace. And the way the acceleration worked was to escalate or start rebombing North Vietnam, to take away student deferments and increase the number of men drafted to fight in Vietnam, and finally to involve countries which were non-combatant countries, Laos and Cambodia, in the war effort. So those things were done in order to twist the arm of North Vietnam to come to the bargaining table and to concede to US demands. So it was a rough time. It was a rough time.
Tell me, well, in this era, we see the cancel culture and the vilification of people who are on the other side. You, as a protester, were you vilified as well? Maybe consider unpatriotic or embarrassment to your country for not supporting the American troops?
You know, in the end, I got lucky because my student deferment was taken away, and I was very afraid. It was the first year that students were forced to participate in the lottery for the draft. Now, it may be just that students should be alongside non-student young men and face the draft. That's another issue. But in any case, I was subjected to the draft. Students were subjected to the draft for the first time, college students. And I was afraid, but my number was high in the end, and I wasn't drafted in a sense. I didn't have to make a decision, although I was greatly on my mind, and what to do should my number be high was quite a worry, and I hadn't worked it out yet. So for me, the mindset was, young men are going to war. I'm not sure we're achieving anything in this war, and the war should be ended, and we shouldn't be expanding it. That's how I felt, and that's why I protested. I'd never spat on or vilified veterans. I felt horrified that some of my compatriots felt that way. But you know, the nature of people sometimes is that if you're not with us, you're against us. And right. I always had a feeling, I was always in the gray area in between. I felt that there should be rapprochement, to use a beautiful French term that's actually an English word, a coming together. The nation needed to discuss things. The nation needed, for the two ends of the spectrum, not to be bitterly hateful or show enmity to one towards the other. They needed to have a dialogue, a peaceful dialogue, to come to terms with that war, just in the way I think our nation today in the United States, and you can even say this of Canada, especially over the truckers and some of the COVID issues and some of the draconian measures taken by the Canadian government. I think there needs to be a dialogue rather than a hatred of two different sides, one another, over issues where there is sincere and honest disagreement on how to proceed. And that's what my book is about. That's what my book espouses.
Right. So there were war protests, and there also were, there were anti-war protests, and there were also pro-war protests. I wonder if the anti-war protesters were considered unpatriotic or traitors.
Well, the rhetoric was that, yes, people who were for the war called people against the war traitors, right, and unpatriotic. And there was name calling in the other direction as well. You know, people who were They were killing Vietnamese, they were murderers, they were espousing murder and warfare, and they were warmongers. There were ugly terms on both sides. And it was a problem. When I have social media today, I have a post that has like 3,500 people who've liked the post, and I think 60,000 people have seen the post on my Facebook website, and people are commenting on it, and they're still angry. They're still angry. My response is, please read the book so that you can sort of sort through the issues a little better. Things are not always black and white, and maybe you'll see that, if you were against the war, maybe you'll see that people who went to war, like one of my major characters who went to Vietnam and fought, become very damaged by war experiences. I took care of those men in veterans hospitals. They have severe PTSD, and they're still haunted by their experiences. Suicide is extremely high in these veterans. In fact, the highest group of people committing suicide in my country right now are veterans, especially those who've suffered combat. It's a real issue. It's a terrible thing to have gone through. We have to appreciate the sacrifices these people made. On the other hand, the people who protested against the war, they should not be vilified either, I don't think. They honestly spoke out against the war. So we need a dialogue over this.
Right. So I'm not sure of the exact year, but to serve in the U.S. military became voluntary, I think 1975, I'm not sure. So that means that before that, people were obliged to participate in the military. You just mentioned there was a sort of a lottery. Can you explain how does that work? Let's say at your time period, whether you were obliged to serve or not. And there was also, if you were in college, maybe you were not obliged.
Well, before the year I got to college in 1971, when I was graduating from high school, there was a lottery. There had been lotteries going back to the 60s when Vietnam earlier required more men to go, and students were exempted from service. In my year, in 1972, for the first time, students were no longer exempted. So their deferments were removed, and they went into the general pool of the lottery with everyone else. And the lottery functioned this way. Every day of the year was put in a big sort of a pot, and numbers were pulled out one by one to correspond with days of the year. So January 1st, and someone would reach into this pot with all these numbers, with numbers 1 to 365 in it, pull out a number. January 1st would be number 271. And then they pull out for January 2nd, they pull out a number, it was number 12. And January 3rd, I'm making up numbers, but that's how it worked. It was a lottery. So every birth date, every day of the year was given a lottery number.
Wow.
And if the draft was, if your number was low, you were going to be drafted. It turns out that numbers up to about 100 to 110 were in danger of being drafted. If your number was below 95, you were drafted. But so somewhere between 95 and 110 or 115, it was a gray zone. Some years, those people weren't drafted. Some years they were, but they drafted, they started with number 1 and they drafted kids right up till they had gotten their quota of men for that year. So my number was high and I didn't have to go. And it was a fearful thing. It was a scary thing. And that's how the draft lottery worked.
Wow.
So it was actually very fair.
So it was a fearful scene, and I believe many of the students of that time, or many of the young men at that time, some of them escaped and came to Canada in order to escape the possibility of war. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And then some years later, those young men who had run to Canada were given amnesty and were allowed to come back home. But that was many years later. What I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is I'd like to give a synopsis of my story.
Please do. Yes. I was coming to that, but yes.
Oh, good. So The Serpent Papers is the name of the novel. It's a historical novel, and it occurs in a time period of 1971 to 1972. And as we've discussed, it goes into a depiction of campus demonstrations, sit-ins, marches, and riots against the escalation of the Vietnam War. And there is a lot of counterculture in the New York 1970s, which is depicted. There are even murders in the book. And it's the story of J.B., who's a young man from Virginia, whose father is a career military officer, a rear admiral in the US Navy. And he's raised in a violent world in the 60s, and he chooses Colombia rather than to join the military like his father's and his grandfather did before him. And in spite of the fact that his best friend also volunteered for Vietnam. So he comes from a conservative Catholic family. And because he comes from a military family, he felt his destiny was always to join the military. And he was surprised at events that take place that steer him away from doing that. And I won't reveal what happens in the book to steer him away, but he steered away from doing that. He ends up going to Colombia, but he exemplifies sort of the struggles of his generation and the challenge they faced in balancing patriotism and a rejection of the Vietnam War. So when he arrives at Columbia University, he's thrust into an anti-war atmosphere. He becomes ideologically trapped between the support of his best friend who's fighting in Vietnam on the one hand, and on the other hand, Columbia's cauldron of anti-war culture and protest. And he has a moral quandary over this, and the war is escalating. The protests come to a head. And as one reviewer of the book, Catherine Morris, in forward reviews says, with his own conscience and the conscience of the nation on his mind, with ratcheting tensions and bullhorns inciting students to protest, the pro-war and anti-war factions collide on campus in riots, and the protagonist, JB, makes a decision that defines his life about the war, and which should serve as a template for those who are still feeling the pain and the division over that war. His decision should be part of resolution of that problem.
The thing about the Vietnam War as opposed to previous war is that in previous war there was a well-defined evil country, let's say, and the objective were clear. Well, in this one, everything seems to be murky, and this, of course, this is what makes this war a topic of debate. No one is debating World War II, for example, or World War I. People still debating the work in Iraq because still the foundation was not clear. It was done under the assumption of weapons of mass destruction, and the work in Vietnam still it was a sneaky way in which the United States got involved. It was not a direct involvement at first, and then it increases that involvement. So I guess in a way, this is why so many people protested and were against the war, because it was right now there is a war in Ukraine, and it's so black and white clear. This is the aggressor, and these are the person who are defending themselves against the aggressor, and that in Vietnam is so murky, you just cannot tell who is who.
I think there's some truth in what you say, and it gets even more complicated to me. Someone once said that the history is written by the victor. Right. So of course you could argue that everything seems black and white going back in time because those who were victorious wrote the stories, and those who were not were either killed or were not allowed to write the story. Right. So in some ways, it's hard to know. Although I think what you say about World War II is certainly true. It seems to me, and I won't comment on Ukraine too much, except to say that it's clear that Russia did enter Ukraine, which is a bit scary. You know, and I don't see the Russians' point of view, to be honest, but you know, I'm sure they're out there trying to tell everyone they have one. The other thing that's interesting is that the media have become very influential over people's mind thought, and there's so much media, and with electronic media now, there's so many different points of view that are being voiced. It's hard to know what the truth is at times. And so when that happens, it's almost like, if I could pick a biblical reference, the Tower of Babel, where everyone is talking a different language and nobody can really communicate with each other because everybody's certain of their point of view, and yet it's really not certain what really is happening because there are too many people reporting different truths. So that can add to a murkiness. Of course, you may not say that that applies to Ukraine, but it may apply to other things. Afghanistan, it may apply to Vietnam, it may apply to other wars going on here and there. There are propagandas being told from all sides. So it's at times very hard to know what's happening. I think probably a case in point would be COVID. I mean, it's been very difficult to sort of decipher the trail of truth in the COVID story, and also to know what we should be doing or shouldn't be doing. Part of this, I think, is the government's responsibility. With such a severe and important problem confronting the nation, and it's not war, there should have been much clearer signals from our leadership on what's happening. And this goes from the very beginning of COVID, in my estimation, to now even. It's still murky stuff, and it's becoming a little clearer because I think the COVID situation is improving. But if it gets worse again, I am afraid that perhaps it could become murkier once again. So somehow the media is stuck in all this and in this lack of clarity. What do you think?
Yeah, let's. I don't want to go out in that tangent because it could take us another half an hour. I want to ask you one more question about your book. I wonder what's the reaction of the people who have already read the book, whether they love it or hate it. And to my opinion, as a writer, you want people to either love or hate. You don't want indifference. So, how has the public accepted your book?
Well, I think that although the book does appeal to multiple age groups, I think it's especially appealing to my age group, that is the baby boomer generation. And certainly the book does apply to what's happening in today's world. So I think it would be of interest to younger folks as well. Having said that, before the book is published, there is a pre-publication copy that goes out to numerous reviewers, and their reviews have been stellar. There have been reviews in some newspapers so far. The Richmond Times-Dispatch and the Fredericksburg Freelance Star have commented. National Public Radio's Joan Baum in Baum on Books has responded. Forward Reviews has responded. All of them have been superb reviews. The New York Journal of Books has said some absolutely mind-bogglingly superb things that I was thrilled with. And if you go to my website, you can read some or all of those reviews. And my website is www.jschnaderauthor.com. That's JSCHNADER author.com. So if you want to read more about it, that's where to find it, I suppose.
Yes, all those links will be in the show notes, and I can sympathize with the idea that for many people your age, I haven't asked you your age, but let's keep it at that. For many people your age will be reliving that moment, that important moment in history. But how would someone younger, let's say a millennial, what value or could they get from your book? How can they interpret the book, the novel, and take some lessons for them to apply in today's world?
Well, first of all, the reviews say that the book is a gripping book. It's a gripping narrative, and it captures your attention, and it's easy to read. It's a very easy read book.
And I vow for that. That I feel, the first few pages I was kind of like, okay, where's this going? But then I feel grip, like page 10. I feel okay when the father hits the son and he wants him to go to Annapolis. I think I am already want to continue turning pages, so I can vouch for how gripping the book is. So carry on. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, that's quite all right. I'm glad you felt that way. But a lot of people have said the same. It's an easy read. It pulls you in fast. And I've even had some of, I have a lot of Canadian friends, and some of them are professors, and I've sent them the book, and they have reviewed the book as well. And their comments actually have been published both on Amazon and on my website, and they were thrilled with the book. So apparently it's a good read even for Canadians. It's not just for a United States audience. And yeah, there have been younger folks who have also reviewed the book and have loved it. I think the message that there is intolerance over severe problems, and that people can become very divided, and issues can be very divisive in a population, whether it's COVID, whether it's Vietnam, Afghanistan, or other issues. This book addresses an issue which divided a nation, and it provides a resolution. So it should be applicable to anybody's age group and apply to our current situation as well.
I find so much truth in something that you said a minute ago, that everything, all our emotions are magnified by the media, and you use this word several times. There should be a reproach man with different ideologies, and we can agree to disagree, and we don't have to cancel each other or even be aggressive towards each other. We could try to reach an understanding. And the funny thing is that after some of these crises pass, then we reflect and we say, no matter from which side you have an opinion, I find a lot of people saying, wow, I think I overreacted. I shouldn't have treated my fellow friend or patriot or citizen with disrespect, but I was influenced by the media and the surrounding and the commotion, the heat of the moment. So yeah, we should reflect that we are going through difficult moments from time to time, but we shouldn't. We should try to understand the other party's perspective.
Well, I mean, I agree with you 100%. And I think that if people would take the time and ask themselves, why is this person thinking the way he or she thinks? Why are they so wrong? And actually thought through their arguments and gave it some thought, and sat down and said, I'm going to listen to this person and find out why this person feels so strongly about that. And through understanding another person's perspective, it may actually bring about a way for two people or two groups of people to see common ground and to realize that some of the issues are not quite so black and white, that they have a good point. They may not be right, but some of their points are good, and we need to address those points. So I think that's where it starts, with what I would call dialectic, a dialogue which is positive and constructive, as opposed to what we so often have, and which is the nature of people, to have a polemic, which is where two groups of people are shouting at each other and just will not see the other's point of view.
Well, yeah, Jeff, one more time, I do like the book. I think it's gripping, and it's a nice window into the past of how we have reacted to difficult moments. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where, and you mentioned your website, you just mentioned it one more time, and yeah.
The title of the book is The Serpent Papers. My name is Jeff Schnader. My website is jschnaderauthor.com, JSCHNADER, author.com. And you can buy the book anywhere books are sold. I think hard copies are in short supply. So if you want a hard copy, you might have to go to the publisher, the Permanent Press website, and otherwise you should be able to find it most anywhere.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Alan.